Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I am going to be doing a review of Razorblade Tears by SA Cosby. And I was really excited to read this book because I've had it on my list forever. I remember when it first came out, I don't know how many years ago it was now, but everybody and their mother was raving about it. It got so many 5 stars, all the booktubers were talking about it. And it just had a bit of a cult following, I feel like. A couple of us were talking about it in the Discord recently, and Mandy, James and I decided to pick it up because we wanted a gritty read. And I have to say, this was not good, in my humble opinion. I gave it 2 stars, in fact. I found it incredibly frustrating to read. I think parts of it were good, particularly in the first like 20%, and then I think it gradually just descended into a bit of a mess. And so I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so telling you why I really did not like this book. Before we jump in, I'm just going to give you a brief plot summary of the book. At its heart, Razorblade Tears is about 2 fathers, one guy who goes by the name of Ike and he is a black ex-con, and then we have Buddy Lee who is a white ex-con, and their sons were married to each other. And at the start of the book, it's essentially their funeral. They were brutally murdered and nobody really knows why they were specifically targeted. The fathers, who both failed their sons, joined forces to essentially hunt down who killed their sons. And so there is a crime element to this. And it's basically like a revenge road trip thriller that has a lot of violence. It's quite gritty and it attempts to explore topics like race, homophobia, grief and redemption. On paper, sounds absolutely excellent, and that's what actually drew me into wanting to read this book in the first place. But I think the execution is where it really fell apart. So let's jump into my brief analysis now. So for me, I think the writing style and the dialogue is actually what frustrated me the more I read the book. The prose swings between being overly lyrical and painfully clunky at the same time. And the dialogue often feels like the characters are delivering speeches rather than speaking like actual people. I will be honest with you, this is a very depressing book in many ways, but some of the dialogue was so dumb that it took me out of the story and it made me laugh out loud. And that is not what you want to be doing with a book that is covering the themes that this book is covering. It is heavy, it is violent, it is extremely gritty, but then these really silly quotes completely take you out of the book. I'm just going to give you like a couple of examples where the writing just doesn't work in my opinion. So sometimes it's like super melodramatic. So I'm going to read one quote to show this. Tears ran from his eyes and stung his cheeks. Tears for his son, tears for his wife, tears for the little girl they had to raise, tears for who they were and what they had all lost. Great. I actually quite like that. And then it ends with, each drop felt like it was slicing his face open like a razor blade. It's a lot. It's pretty overdramatic, but I didn't mind the first like 70% of it. Like, grief is very messy, grief is disordered, grief is very chaotic, but this kind of makes it feel not that very moving. And the slicing his face open like a razor blade, like it just kind of takes you out of it. I don't know about you guys, but it took me out of it and it kind of made me like take a pause, but like not in a good way. Then we have another one, this nugget of wisdom. Folks like to talk about revenge like it's a righteous thing, but it's just hate in a nicer suit. Sounds deep, I guess, but I think the book leans so hard on these types of sentences that it kind of feels like a quote you would see on a bumper sticker. I don't know, it just doesn't work for me. I don't know. There's some really crude lines as well in this book. Again, I don't really mind crudeness if it's like done well. I'm not going to read the whole quote because I will probably get like a violation on my video, but I will like mime the end word. I wouldn't even say it out loud myself because it's not a very nice word. You're going to regret ever crawling out of your mama's old chewed up. Charming, right? Like, I get this is supposed to be gritty, and like I said, I'm not against using shocking language in fiction. But like it just feels really odd and like really jarring. It's very clear to me that this is there for maximum shock value, not because that particular scene needed it. Instead of immersing me in the book, it actually just made me roll my eyes. And I remember sending that quote to James and Mandy as we were reading it, and I was like, what is this? Like, this is just really weird. It is edgy just for the sake of being edgy, in my opinion. And that's the problem that I think I had throughout this book. Instead of gritty realism, it often feels like an imitation of toughness. Like, it's almost like every character is auditioning for a Tarantino script. Let's talk about tone and pacing now. The tone, I would say, is kind of like you're experiencing whiplash. On one page, there's like ultra-violent blood paths. On the next, there's tender monologues about grief and prejudice. And instead of those two extremes complementing one another, they actually clash. The pacing is also really uneven. I think sometimes the story just barrels along like way too fast, which results in skipped character development. Other times it bogs us down with repetitive shootouts and filler. So instead of what I thought I was going to get, which is like a tight, relentless thriller, it feels incredibly bloated and messy. I'm going to talk about characters now because I think a lot of people really like the characters in this book. And I did at the start of the book, but I kind of felt like they were caricatures by the end of it, which is really unfortunate to say. The two fathers, you know, they're grieving, they're wrestling with racism, homophobia, and also regret. Super compelling. And I think there's so many ways that you could take that. But in practice, they are extraordinarily exaggerated to the point where they really do feel like caricatures. They feel really like fake. It just kind of feels like, I don't know, it just feels really dishonest. I don't know. Their growth doesn't always feel earned. Sometimes they just flip a switch from being bigoted to being enlightened because the story needs them to be. We don't actually see that trajectory of growth that you would hope to see in a book like this. The sons, Isaiah and Derek, are completely underwritten. They are plot devices, not people that we actually know anything about or that we get to know by the end of the story. And the villains, they are cartoonishly evil. Lines like the one that I mimed earlier are just much less about character depth and more about cartoon level cruelty, in my opinion. There is absolutely no nuance in this book, and I'm honestly quite shocked that I'm saying that because that's exactly what I was hoping to get in this story. Now let's talk about themes, and I think this is where the book really fails in like pretty much every way. The author is clearly trying to do something ambitious here, and I completely respect that. He is trying to tackle topics like racism, homophobia, toxic masculinity, grief, redemption, all wrapped up in a revenge thriller. Like, that's pretty cool in my opinion. But I think overall, as I've already kind of alluded to, the representation feels completely shallow and mishandled. So let's start with race first. So Ike, the black father, he constantly reminds us that he is a black man in the South. And it often feels like a checklist rather than a genuine exploration of what it means to be a black man from and in the South. Instead of like digging into the nuances of systemic racism or the lived reality of being a black ex-con, his perspective is mostly reduced to a few heavy-handed speeches. It doesn't actually feel like we're inhabiting his experience. It feels like we are being told it, but we're not actually seeing how that has directly impacted him. We then have Buddy Lee, who is the white father, and his racism is painted with such broad strokes that his redemption arc feels completely cheap. He goes from casually spewing racial slurs to suddenly being Ike's brother-in-arms. And it's literally like he's flipped a light switch and there's no reasonable explanation as to why he has done that. As we all know, real growth and real unlearning takes time. And yes, obviously you can't always show that growth from like a time perspective in a novel, but there is definitely ways and tools and mechanisms that you can use to show that. And I don't think the book shows any insight into that hard work that goes into you undoing all the things that you've learned and internalized. Essentially, the book is just telling us he's changed now, accept it, forgive him, and move on. And I just think that's a really inauthentic representation of what it takes to fundamentally change yourself. Another aspect of this that I want to briefly touch upon, I was thinking this as I was reading it, and I have also read some stuff on Reddit of folks who come from this community, which is that the LGBTQ plus representation is like not very good, and it's like incredibly frustrating. The murdered sons are essentially props for the story, and they are barely present as actual people. Like, we know nothing about them, their lives, their relationship, their identities as gay men. None of it is fleshed out, none of it is explored. Like, it is purely just a device to get their two fathers together and tell us about their story ultimately, which is, you know, while that can be fair, like that this book is ultimately their story, it would also have been nice to have had more exploration of those two characters. Like, I just feel like he didn't do justice to those characters, regardless of their like background. Like, they're just not well fleshed out individuals. And because of that, because they're not given actual proper page time, their deaths don't really carry any emotional resonance, because we don't care for these characters. We know nothing about them. We don't know them well enough to feel the weight of the loss beyond what it means for their dads. And I think that's the difficulty of writing a book where you're just, you know, kind of put into a situation without any real context. I think this book reduces those two characters, Isaiah and Derek, really just to simples, which is actually quite ironic when you look at it in the context of a book that is about confronting prejudice. So I think instead of this being like a thoughtful exploration of racism and homophobia, I think it's just a book that ends up using identities as props to motivate a violent revenge story. And I just think that's not only disappointing, but I actually think it's quite exploitative. I'm not saying that the author did that intentionally or anything like that, but I think like that in itself is actually quite concerning, that your kind of approach is to automatically just reduce people who come from particularly marginalized groups in society and just kind of reduce them down to roles that really have no gravitas to them. Like, it's not what I was expecting from this book, particularly when you look at the reviews. I think it's got like a 4.5 stars on Goodreads. Everybody raved about it and still continues to rave about it. So I was really expecting like a level of detail that I don't think we typically get with these types of books. And unfortunately, it just ended up being the exact thing that I didn't want it to be. I think if you're going to tackle themes this heavy, like, you need nuance, you need empathy, you need depth. And I think Razorblade Tears is trying to do a lot, but I think it ultimately falls flat in what it's trying to do. So ultimately, that's why I gave it a 2 stars. I think the premise was great. I think some moments of action were quite gripping, and I like the ambition of the book. But what I think really sank it for me overall was just the overwrought writing, the melodramatic dialogue, the gratuitous edge, the caricatured characters, and the complete lack of exploration when it came to these themes. It's incredibly shallow in my opinion, and it's completely over the top, and I don't think there's much that is redeeming about this book, if I'm completely honest. So there we have it. That's my little, I wouldn't call this a rant review, to be honest, but maybe it's a little bit of a rant, but I don't think there was much that was really engaging about this book. So I'm really curious if there's anybody who feels the same way. And just to add, Mandy and James had the exact same experience. I don't know if we three are like the weird ones who just didn't get it, but I'm really curious if anybody else read this book and felt the same way. And I'm also curious to hear from people who loved it and why you loved it and enjoyed about it so much. So I'll see you down below in the comments as usual, folks. Thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you in my next one. Stay safe, take care, and I'll see you very, very soon.